On this episode of The Ethics Experts, we talk to Greg Walters of the SEC. We dive into AI, its opportunities and its risks, and how you can embrace it to make more impact in your organization. Let's learn.
Welcome to The Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to The Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you're a returning subscriber, hey, bestie. Hope you're having an amazing day. You see what happens when you subscribe to The Ethics Experts. You get a bonus greeting on every episode. So hit that subscribe button and join us as we change the world. I'm here with the one and only Greg Walters, king of the universe. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Just kidding. Greg has a lot of great experience. He has 30 years of experience in federal programs. He's worked at the SEC. He's worked in the Peace Corps. He's done a bunch of litigation. And right now he's really focused on artificial intelligence and its intersection with ethics and compliance. Greg, welcome to the Ethics Experts.
Hey, thank you so much. And thank you for the modest introduction. I told you to downplay it, and I think you successfully did that. So
yeah, I don't want to go too crazy with that. Yeah.
Thank you.
So Greg, I always love to start at the beginning because I just love origin stories. So I'm sure when you were a little boy, you were not thinking about working in the SEC. So I'd love to hear about what your childhood was like and what set you on this path that you're on right now.
Okay, I just want to preface in my capacity as a regulatory person that my remarks are not intended to represent the policy of the Securities and Exchange Commission, especially my remarks about my childhood. Those are not official federal policy in any way, shape, or form. But anyway, the childhood, I read a lot. I got an award from the Wilton Public Library one summer for having read the most books, like as a 10-year-old over the summer or whatever. It was like a couple hundred or something. I mean, I gamed the system, I'll admit it now, 40 years later. But, I guess I was kind of a nerd, interested in science, interested in everything, to be blunt, anything book-related, nature, whatever, just having an inquisitive mind, I suppose. And I grew up kind of in the city, kind of New York City area, but also in the suburbs, in the woods. So I kind of had I was interested in hanging out and running in the woods and riding the bike in the woods, but also going to museums and cultural concerts, whatever. So it's just pretty well-rounded, I'd say.
So then you kind of started getting into college and stuff like that, and you set on a path of law. What was it about law that was so attractive for you?
I think to be honest, I mean, I looked at my skill set, and I'm a good reader. I can understand stuff pretty well, and I can write pretty well. And I figured, how can I make money using those skills? And a lawyer sort of came to mind as a possible way of doing it. My degree is actually in economics, but actually, as I found it practiced, I did some internships while in college. It's not as interesting intellectually as I thought it might be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, why though?
But at least with the law, and you work and you impact people's lives, and you can see direct results. And honestly, if you ask me what keeps you going every day, it's basically to work with quality people and create results that impact lives. I think that, in a nutshell, is why you do really anything, but especially law, compliance, working in an agency, what have you.
Did you just find kind of econ to just be too kind of academic, and it didn't have that sort of human interaction where you felt like you were really making a life?
I mean, it's quite honestly, 30 years out or whatever, it's a lot of it just seems to be BS, to be blunt. I mean, humans are not math equations. The idea of what a rational consumer is just something that you and I could talk about for the rest of time. It's all just kind of noise, in my opinion, but actually getting a result in a courtroom or giving the best quality answer to what's going on in the legislative world, or figuring out a strategy for beating an opponent in a case, that's concrete. And so maybe that's why I prefer working in the law over sort of economics.
I mean, I'm sure with your time in the law, you've kind of seen that the underpinning assumption that holds all of econ together is not real. Kind of to your point, this thought of like a rational consumer. Like, what is that? I mean, that is, though, the linchpin of all econ, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's also it's a lot of economics, especially. I went to the University of Chicago, which is a phenomenal school. It's very math-based and calculus, and that was a large part of the degree program. Right. And I just feel, I mean, maybe it's because of who I am, but I just felt trying to quantify things with math. You can make interesting arguments with it, but to me, it's all by nature, by definition, academic, because it's taking something organic, which is human, the experience in a marketplace, and trying to impose an artificial construct, which in this case is ironically math, which is by itself a construct.
Yeah, that's so true. So how has that experience in econ helped you in this other path that you've kind of chosen to go down? Is there stuff you've drawn from that in terms of like your exposure to these models and in terms of the exposure to these ways of thinking that has been able to kind of been synergistic with the path you've taken?
I mean, one guy I knew who graduated with a degree in economics said that what it really means is that you know how to think. And so I think critical thinking skills that you develop, whether you do math or economics or what have you, that's something you'll take with you regardless of whether you go into law, compliance in general, what have you. So it's the thinking skills which are most important. And to be honest, you don't have to do economics to do that. You can pretty much do anything as long as you're learning to look at evidence, think critically, and try and draw inferences that are rational, and also to deconstruct arguments that are made by others and figure out what their premises are, whether those are faulty or not, how can they be attacked, whether they're now valid. Again, those kinds of critical skills, the more you learn of them, the better you'll be regardless of what you do.
Yeah, they're so transferable, it's kind of to your point. So you go into law school and then tell me about kind of what area in law, in law school really resonated with you and you said, this is what I'm going to do.
I think some of it is, I did an internship as a law student at the U.S. Attorney's Office in San Diego. And I got credit for it because I went to school in San Diego, and I really enjoyed the large dollar amounts and the complexity of the cases in the federal government, because the federal government has like virtually unlimited amounts of money, and they buy all kinds of stuff and they do all kinds of stuff, and it causes all kinds of problems. So if you work on a case involving the federal government, chances are, number one, it's going to be big dollars, so you get like big lawyers working on it, like smart people. And number two, it's consequential because it involves a lot of money or a high profile program. I worked on one case that had to deal with I think the Army, if I'm not mistaken, it had to do with an Army suing Ford for a defect in a vehicle used in military transportation. And I got to write the complaint on it while just a law student. Wow. And that was to be filed in federal district court. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. This is, it's fun to work on these really big cases as just a little old law student and maybe just as a junior lawyer. So I think that's kind of what made me interested in federal law per se.
Yeah, it's like it matters. It's like the stuff you're working on matters. We're not arguing about, we're not arguing with an HOA whether we can have this mailbox or not. You know what I mean? It's something massive.
That's a critical. I can tell you HOA stories, and actually, your legal skills came into play. One of the neighbors wanted to put in expand the footprint of their house, and I happened to know that they would require. Well, they needed 2 different driveways. And there's local zoning laws as to when you put a driveway in, you have to affect the curve of the road. And you can only have certain indentations in the curve. And the fact that you would have 2 driveways in a certain number of feet would violate a particular ordinance or something like that. So you'd be surprised. Even the smallest thing becomes highly litigated and consequential. And I did all this paperwork. And basically, the party across the street or whatever, they folded.
Did they?
So it's just like
it works everywhere.
You never know when this stuff. It's again the critical thinking
exactly.
and just how much energy and passion you put into stuff.
So after that internship, what was sort of your next stopover? What was your next step?
I worked for the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. It was then called the Claims Court for 2 federal judges in Washington, D.C. And that I learned to really write like a lawyer, learn to research, learn to provide deliverables, which in this case was drafts of judicial opinions. Generally, how it worked was the judge would hear the arguments, read the briefs, and tell you which way he or she wanted to go. and then you had to draft something for the judge, and then they would look at it and edit it. So it was a good way to get hands-on experience in legal writing and research, and also to hear arguments, essentially, and hear how lawyers from DOJ, Department of Justice, and the private sector would argue these cases. Again, I was in the court itself dealt with just primarily government contracts claims that were in excess of $10,000 plus. So these are large dollar claims. These involve, so you're going to hire good lawyers to litigate them, and so you get to be around good work product. And that was important if you're a young lawyer.
And just absorbing that sort of line of thinking that these judges would have, just being able to reflect on the edits that they gave on your complaints or whatever you were writing on their behalf was probably just really a time of super learning for you.
Yeah, no, it was critical those first couple of years. I was there for 2 years, and then that helped me get my first job, which was with the Commodity Futures Trading Commission in their general counsel's office.
So what was that like, and when was that? When did you join?
This was right in the early 90s. So it involved I was there, I think, I was exposed to all kinds of regulatory law, including the Freedom of Information Act. And I think I recall if you remember or don't remember, it doesn't matter, but there was an issue about trying to get records on Hillary Clinton's. She did something with, I think, cattle trades where she turned in the futures market $1,000 into $100,000. And I think the Republicans were asking for records of of that transaction. And I think the issue was that somehow they were not available. And I was vaguely looped into that when it occurred. And so you get some kind of interesting sort of high profile work there, although however you want to characterize it. But I do remember that. And at that time I was learning about the Freedom of Information Act, which is, critical. I still work on FOIA stuff to this day, but it has to do with how U.S. citizens, private citizens, can get access to documents from the federal government. And the federal government creates untold amounts of work product. And FOIA is the way that the average citizen or the press understands what's really going on.
Right.
So it's extremely important.
So your time at the Commodity Trade, or was it the Commodity Trade Commission?
Commodity Futures Trading Commission.
Or the Future Trading Commission, yeah. What was the biggest lesson, or as you look back on that time there, what is the biggest kind of lesson that the biggest tool you put in your toolbox from swimming in that pool?
I'd say, honestly, I think some of it was the impact of the politics, because you get political appointees and people who are more partisan and how that can influence policy in the federal government. Because there's always at least two sides to every point. And in politics, there could be an endless amount of positions on a particular point. And you can see how agendas are change regulatory actions. I mean, you really see that. And although, honestly, the CFTC and the SEC, for that matter, are independent regulatory agencies, and that they're not directly controlled by the White House. It's a different mechanism for appointing the commissioners and the chair of these organizations and the terms and all that. Nevertheless, if something happens in D.C., it has a political implication of some sort. So, and again, it's not that a good bad type thing. The way I look at it, it's just like this is how some others look at this particular issue. And generally, the people I met, at least at the CFTC. They're all very intelligent, and you may disagree with them, but they're not crazy or anything like that. Same at the other agencies. I mean, there's different ways of looking at an issue, and you sort of, if you're going to be in at least a career in government, you have to sort of have, in my opinion, that perspective that you support the organization, you support who you report to, and you put your own personal beliefs aside per se, and you just support what the mission is at that time.
Yeah. Because kind of to your point, there's multiple ways to look at things, and there's some premise that somebody's coming from, and you may disagree with that premise, or you may disagree with how they look at the world, but they're not usually just a raging lunatic. You know what I mean?
Right. They're not evil or raging lunatics or something. There's a reason for where they're coming from. I mean, I'll say this though. I mean, in my years of government, not within the agency per se, but contractors and things like that. I mean, I worked in contracting, federal contracts for a number of years as well. and there is waste, fraud, and abuse. You'll see that in federal contract. I know that firsthand because I work with the contracting officers and help them report to the inspector general at one of my prior agencies. And I had firsthand knowledge because I worked on the contract modifications, and I saw the junk going on. And again, that's a whole nother category of things where why do some organizations get federal contracts, why some don't, and what's the backstory there? Are they the people who run these contractors? Are they connected politically to the current administration or not? Things like that. That's when you get into that stuff that, at least from my perspective, is really that's not it's just a matter of opinion. No, that's something that's not in anyone's interest, and that's why they're like the role of the inspector general, which is in federal agencies, is so critical because there's at least some mechanism there to stop some of the, again, waste, fraud, and abuse.
Yeah, because it makes its way into it. And to your point, that's kind of a binary, like objective thing. That's not a sort of subjective thing that you can kind of have a valid position on, in my view.
Absolutely.
So, now you're kind of in the compliance game, the ethics game at some level. Talk to me about that transition from the Futures, the Futures Commission to that.
I think I worked on a few ethics questions. You have to understand that the ethics program in the federal government is very important. It's very strong. It impacts federal employees when they're on the clock during the day and at night too. Like as a federal employee, for example, I can't do fundraising for partisan political candidates. I can't, have anything at my house and try and raise money for whomever. You tell me, Biden, Trump, Kennedy, whoever, it doesn't matter. So that's that, and I'm not on the clock doing that. It's just that there's certain things you just can't do. So it's an important part of the federal government and how it handles its personnel, how it disciplines its personnel. You have to be mindful of all these ethics rules. And what's interesting too is that each agency has their own ethics rules. There's like I think 12 ethics principles applicable to all federal employees, regardless of your rank. But there's also particular ones with respect to activities. And if you work for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, you can't you can't go out and buy HUD homes or whatever and try and run it like a Section 8 program or something like that. Because it creates an appearance in the judgment of the people who wrote those rules. It creates an appearance problem per se. Even if you had did nothing wrong, it just looks bad. And you'll see a lot of the rules in the federal agencies for their respective employees it just looks bad in our judgment, so you can't do it. And when you sign up for the federal government, you got to say, hey, these are you accept that, in your off hours, you're going to be restricted in your activities. Same for your duty hours. And that's just part of being a federal employee, period, regardless of whether you're the lowest or the highest ranked. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, they want to try to make, they want everyone to be actually and apparently independent.
Or is not subject to any appearance of problems. The appearance of impropriety is sort of the lingo that's used. Right. You don't want any suggestion. You want the idea that all your federal employees will make decisions only in the best interest of the government, of the public, and not in their own personal interest, not for their own, or their spouse, or their whatever minor children, or what have you.
This conversation's been pretty interesting because, you've talked about the government almost as like an organization. And I haven't really spent a lot of time thinking about, the values overlay and sort of the cultural and ethical organizational management component of managing this, hundreds of thousands of people, I'm sure. Like that's a very interesting aspect, and it's a very difficult thing to administrate at such a high level. Like how do you maintain that sort of umbrella of consistency across these 12 principles, as you said, but also allow for enough flexibility for individual departments or individual organizations to establish their own culture appropriate for the mission that they're on?
Right. And then that's where it gets into, with government, it's always a bureaucracy. You have the Office of Government Ethics, which was created in response to the Watergate scandal back in the late 70s. And before then, honestly, I'm not sure what they did for ethics regulations of federal employees. I think it was a lot more probably just disobeying an order of a superior or something military type enforcement. But it got very specific after Watergate, and over the decades since, it's gotten more and more. I'll say the word particular. The rules have gotten, I'd say, more tightened. And again, the idea is that government employees should do their work and represent the interests of the government. The ethics rules, for example, they prohibit certain things, what you can and can't do when you go on travel for official business. There's limits on what you can and can't do and what you should and shouldn't do when you create an event. Like the big scandal, I think it was in 2010, was, I believe, with the GSA. They had a conference in Las Vegas, and they spent appropriated money, that's federal tax dollars in their budget, on stuff that had nothing really to do with increasing the training for management purposes or employee training. It was more like entertaining the feds, essentially, and like having like mind readers on stage and paying appropriated money for that. And that there's all kinds of rules that came out after that, because Congress is always looking at federal employees and wondering, is this something we need to regulate more? And the White House is always looking at its federal executive branch employees. Is this something we need to respond to either give them more freedom, like with teleworking, or less? And so again, a lot of this, and it's not necessarily a right or wrong with a lot of these questions, as I like to point out. It's more like a matter of policy, and there's reasonable arguments on all sides. So again, it's been growing, and honestly, I don't think it's going away. And I think the most interesting thing, in my opinion, is technology, because there's things that'll go. There's programs that are, I think they're in the developmental stage. I'll put it at that, where they're thinking about more monitoring federal employees' transactions, personal transactions with respect to like stocks and things that may be prohibited by an agency directly through brokerages and things like that, like sort of real time almost. And eventually they'll probably be able to do that. This would go into our AI discussion.
Right.
I think, in my opinion, there's some constraints, not on the technology to implement it, but just on the sort of the bandwidth for data collection and management, because there's so much data being created, and it needs to be handled and quickly and accessed quickly. And I think it's just a constraint on literally like server sizes and things like that. They're collecting so much, and yet if you want to work with it, you've got to work with it in these huge volumes. So how do you do that? And that's kind of where we're at, I think. It's not so much that we could create programs that will do all that. It's like, do we have the resources to implement it on the scale so that everyone is appropriately impacted by it?
Yeah, and we minimize while kind of minimizing unintended consequences from a broken model or an incorrect conclusion or something.
That's what the federal government and a lot of state governments, especially my home state of Colorado, they're looking into, and how does it impact the individual? How should it impact the individual? And those are questions that literally are being debated almost as we speak. It's certainly in Congress, the Senate, and in the various legislatures around the United States and the world, for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, this AI thing is like, we're just the tip of the iceberg with it. And I was thinking yesterday when I was walking my dog, like 5 years from now, it's going to look so wildly different. Like the intersection of AI with our day-to-day lives and with our professional lives. I mean, we really have no clue on the scope of that, like what that could potentially be. Like, think about when the internet came out in 1996. People were, Krugman was talking about that, like it was like, it's just going to be a fax machine. Look at it now. It's like everything. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I gave a talk on AI and also quantum computing, which I think is also, it's sort of the spouse, if you will, to AI, at least in my opinion. And one thing is that AI has been around for decades. And actually, I read an article about the IRS in 1984 implementing artificial intelligence to help them with their tax assessments.
Interesting.
So it's been used for decades. It's just that what's going on now is the level of sophistication that because of the advances in technology have allowed it to be more in our face, for lack of a better word. And ideally, and this was from, I think, one of the Google AI gurus, were saying, like, within 5 years, each of us will have a personal AI assistant that, in my mind, will monitor everything we do online and probably offline for that matter, and talk to us as a person and help us schedule activities. And I think, not to jump around topics, but to jump around topics, the first thing that you'll see with AI is always chatbots. And the chatbots get better and better. And what I think we've seen in the past week with AI, just this past week, was the Chat GPT 4.0. You're seeing something that's essentially a supercharged chatbot that you can converse in real time. You can take your phone and look around the room. It'll tell you what's going on, what they think you're doing in that room. It'll give you, in other words, it's basically becoming a super duper chatbot. And if I were starting a career in ethics or your industry per se, I'd say, well, how is that going to impact jobs, or how is that going to impact an organization when everyone doesn't need to talk to their ethics advisor? They can just go to the ethics
chatbot, yeah.
And they'll give you an answer. And how do we know that answer is good? How do we know that answer is not discriminatory? That kind of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of an interesting question. I like in a lot of ways, because these concerns that we have about AI giving us bad information, right? That's kind of it, biased information, something like that, is obviously a risk. But like that risk obviously exists with the human being you're talking to.
Correct. And that's the larger point that I try and make. I'm glad you said that, because we've been getting incorrect information for our whole lives.
Exactly.
Even before AI, before the internet, even, people make mistakes.
For
people
sure.
have biases. They say things or they say things in good faith that's not a mistake, but because of the nature of language, you may interpret it and not in the way it was intended, or, those kinds of things. So we're always working with imperfect information. It's just that I think there's a real worry, which is well-founded, about the discriminatory effects of AI. And people who have studied it longer than I have, at least one person has said, look, there's no way you're going to be able to get out all the discriminatory effects of an algorithm. And my point is, which others have made, is that also AI has to be trained on a database and all that. And again, if you have a garbage database, then you're going to get a garbage AI result. And again, what is garbage? I don't know. My data, I might say this is what you need to look at to build your AI model, and you may disagree. And because my model doesn't include or includes things that you don't like or like. So again, and then who's going to certify? Is this something that, your organization certifies as a good AI result and whatever it says you'll work with, or not? I mean, these are the questions that right now are being debated by the powers that be, both here in the U.S. and around the world. So but again, I think as you and I talk about it, and we still have to recognize that, like, for things like financial fraud, for example, there's already tools for implementing what is fraudulent behavior. And, regardless of what AI does or doesn't do, if someone's intending to commit fraud, if they're using an AI tool or not, they're still committing fraud. And I think we need to be mindful of that as well even in the years to come, when we all have our AI assistants and all that.
That's a great point.
Yeah,
bad actors are going to adjust, and they're going to adapt. And I mean,
gotcha.
Think about when my dad was young. This was probably in the early 60s or something. It was very easy to make fake IDs because they were just like a card. You just had to get a typewriter. You just had to type the stuff on there, and then you could be 18 going to a bar. Fast forward to when I was in college, to get it to, fake IDs were still around. Of course, people were still selling them, but it was so much more sophisticated. Guys were printing the holograms on there, and they knew what all the codes were from these different books. They were photoshopping it. And so that was in response to the new controls that the codes on the ID provided, or the watermarks, or those, holograms. And so it's just fascinating to me that bad actors will always adjust for whatever the circumstances are, and they will find the cracks in it to try to, exploit it, regardless of how sophisticated it is. I just wonder what the terminus of that is, or what the limit of that dynamic is,
Yeah, I mean, I guess the answer I would have is I'm not aware of any limit. I don't think. I think, and maybe the answer is that society and the courts or the law determines what that limit is, and then we have to all play around those rules.
Yeah.
And whether that limit is valid or not will be always a bit of contention, perhaps. But I think that's where we're getting at. We don't know though at this point, because we just the technology as it's being implemented right now is new, and it's rapidly being rolled out. What I saw with the ChatGPT 4.0 is amazing. And it's going to be a brilliant chatbot. And I was just imagining all the implications of it. The other thing I wanted to mention just while we're talking is there's kind of like a hierarchy of things in the ethics world. And I've heard about this on calls and whatnot, where ethics officials, compliance officials, they want to see it at the big boy or big girls table. They want to be right next to the general counsel. They want to be another VP that directly reports to the CEO or the leader of the organization. And I get that, but a lot of times they're not. And it's usually, and in my travels, it's more that the general counsel is the one who's going to have the ear of the leader rather than a compliance official, or these compliance officials will report up to the general counsel or what have you. But I think in looking at this AI question for your viewers and all that is the legal profession, from what I've seen, is really getting into AI.
Yeah.
And so when the legal profession gets into it and it's being spoon-fed, that's not the right word. It's more like a buffet of AI stuff and that's being given to us. When we're going to be on board, that means if you're going to report to us or you're going to compete with us for a space on the board table, you better have your AI game up as well, because we'll be using it and we'll be bought into it. And so you guys who aren't lawyers or aren't the general counsel, you guys better be on that page as well. That's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I love that 2 cents. I'd love to make that into a nickel. What about the compliance folks do you think will cause them to struggle with that adoption? Do you think there's an archetypal sort of compliance thing that, whether it's a personality or a positional like acclamation to what they're focused on, that might make them sort of lag behind, GC, lawyer, whatever, adoption of this sort of vague technology?
I think some of it is, I think people who do ethics and compliance work generally are people persons. They like working individually, one-on-one. They care a lot about doing good. They tend to have a lot of, worried about integrity. And they're not necessarily like tech savvy, or that's not the right word, but they don't embrace technology because it's not a person. It's not human, really. It's literally that. It's technology. It's not that. And so somehow they've got to understand maybe that the technology is a way of helping people and embrace it on that as a way of accessing it. I mean, that's how I view it anyway, because I'm not like, wedded to any particular technology product. I just find it fascinating. And I find it, in my opinion, it's like to me, it's the backbone or the spinal cord for everything we do in our civilization is technology based. So if you're going to be part of whatever it is, this community we have, you've got to have some facility with that technology and also be open to accepting it as it changes. And right now it's extraordinary change. I mean, to me, it's going to be more impactful than the internet, in my opinion.
Maybe by like orders of magnitude. Yeah.
No, it really will, because think about it. You'll have someone who could theoretically monitor everything that you do 24/7 and give you advice any of that time. It's like having it could be an army of experts constantly at your disposal. It's just mind-boggling that'll work endlessly. They won't have to worry about employee grievances. You won't have to worry about union agreements. You won't have to worry about layoffs, issues at their families. It's going to change a lot, and there's no. I think the government's certainly trying to get its hands around that. I think every entity is as well. But it's there. We could have it right now, I think, but for bandwidth issues, we just don't have the computer capacity to process that much.
Back to your kind of quantum marriage, the quantum computing marriage, the necessity of that to really unleash this other piece.
That, in my mind, that's kind of how it works. Quantum computing, the issue there is what everyone should know, because they probably don't pay attention to it as much, is that quantum computing means applying quantum physics principles to computing, as in quantum mechanics principles. And so that allows for unlocking of what we think are formerly encrypted stuff. Like if I went and stole all your stuff right now, like I got a thumb drive of all your personal information, and he'd say, well, I don't care, Greg, because it's all encrypted and I've got state-of-the-art encryption. Then once quantum computing goes into place, I can take that thumb drive and go, well, too bad, so sad. My quantum computer can do things like do faster computations and whatnot. And it can unlock all your stuff that was encrypted back in 24. So too bad, so sad. Now I've got all of that access to this information, albeit it's probably a couple of years old now. But that's a huge risk right there. And quantum computing is not going to replace classical computing, the ones and zeros that we got now, but it's going to do certain things really fast. And one of them is going to allow for de-encrypting stuff that we've got right now. And that's why the federal government is focusing on let's get our systems up so they're quantum compute, their
quantum proof or something.
Up. So yeah, they're quantum computing proof to the extent we know we can do that. Yeah. That's the other thing. No, there's no guarantees in this business, and so we're thinking, if we have these kinds of algorithms on for encryption, it should work because based on what we think quantum computing will be like in 5 years or so.
Right.
So that's within our lifetimes. That's within 10 years. That's like an existential risk that's right in our face, 100%.
I mean, that's wild, right? I mean, the rate of change of just how our life is changing, how we're doing business is changing at such a fast rate. There's the famous thing of regulation can't keep up with technology at the government level, right? Like people say that all the time. But also that also happens at a micro level within an organization where there is like early adopters of a technology on the front lines or, kind of throughout the organization, and the company leadership, whoever, who's setting policies, they're not kind of you're not going to get good at AI and understand AI, in my opinion, unless you're like messing with it and you're like swimming in that and, kind of seeing how it all works. And I think in many cases, there's like sort of this unknown risk. There's a like anti-early adopterism many times in our industry, to your point about kind of, not being like at the forefront of all the technological advances that essentially create like a headwind for, potentially proper policy response to, what's actually out there. And so that gap can grow like exponentially faster in this realm where there's so much advancement happening and like the scope of what this whole thing can touch is kind of a question mark. Like nobody knows what that true sort of, frontier is, I guess.
Yeah, I think some of it too, there's a couple of points too. One is there's also legal risk. We don't know if I use this AI product, am I going to get sued for using it? Because I don't know what they used for their data source to create the AI. And maybe by using it, I can be somehow liable as a third party or whatnot. And so there's that. There's also the issue, all this stuff costs money. If you want to refresh your software, you want to go buy a new product, especially for ethics and compliance, that isn't necessarily the first thing that an organization is going to put money on.
Yeah, right.
It's sort of so you're fighting for dollars essentially within an organization, and even in the federal government, because we have all this other stuff that we need to comply with that has nothing to do with AI. It has to do with other, like at least in the IT security world, there's other things that we need documented. There's processes we need to have in place so audits can be done better. All that costs money to do, and it takes time that we could be doing rolling out AI implementation. So there's a lot of factors at play here, not just one. But the issue that like we're talking about right now is they're all hitting us at the same time. It's like, gosh, all this neat AI stuff is coming down. It's obvious to see how its impact will be, but I can't even get money for an upgraded, forms program so that, the people who are teleworking can do it in a secure environment or a more secure environment. Or, general counsel's office told me I need to get, I have to upgrade to these products. I'm having trouble getting $50,000 for that. So how am I going to get AI tools for everybody?
Yeah,
it's kind of thing. That's the real world.
Yeah, that's the real world because there's scarce resources. There's not like abundant time, abundant money. So there's these kind of trade-off decisions that are made in the context of what's most important, what's the biggest risk, whatever. And there's a lot of subjectivity behind those premises that lead to those conclusions. And the odds that every single conclusion is right is obviously zero. So you just kind of make your best bet, and you play catch up when you have to, I guess. Like back to the Whitewater thing, right? There was a bunch of controls that didn't exist that disaster caused, that caused a response, that now we have new controls and we have new policies to help prevent those things from happening, right? What do you, when you're zooming out of this thing and you're maybe looking at it from your agency perspective, or even, from your king of the universe or whatever you call yourself, just kidding. From that perspective, what do you think people are getting wrong about AI right now? And like either from like a benefit perspective or just from like a risk perspective?
I think one is that you're already using it and you've been using it for years. It could be, even with like all the Amazon products, with Alexa, Siri, and all that. That's AI.
Yep.
It's pattern recognition. It's not the Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator or whatever AI or machine, but it's still AI. So you've been living with it, folks. It's nothing new. And then the other thing is that it's baked in the cake. That's my favorite phrase, because the federal government, you can look at Senator Schumer from New York. He's working on a bipartisan, it's like I guess it's a bill. It's a Senate proposal for I think it's $32 billion to help grow the AI effort in the federal government. Like this summer.
Oh, cool.
Like this summer. It's not, the government is going to push it out heavily. And when the government pushes out heavily, the private sector is going to follow. And because there's federal money involved, people are going to want government contracts. You and I, as private citizens, if we want to access federal services, we're going to interact with AI in the federal government. It's going to go on, whether you like it or not, whether it's good or bad, whether it's done correctly or not. It's in our face. And I'd say, work with it. That's all, and accept it. But I'm of the opinion. I mean, you and I we could talk, about what we like to do in our spare time or personal time. The stuff I do has nothing to do with technology or AI. In terms of, it's more like health related, like do yoga or work, go outside, go for a mountain bike ride, that kind of stuff. That's really important. That ain't going to change with AI.
Right.
And yet that's something that's a very high priority for me, like diet, exercise, and things like that ain't going to change. And that stuff's critical to keep everything going.
Right.
But the other aspects of our lives are going to change. And we need to just not suggest there's an alternative. There isn't any, and at least in our civilization, as far as I can see. You're going to work with it. It's not going to be a smooth ride, but it's right in our face. And everyone we know is going to work with it because they're all going to want federal benefits, and they're all going to work in the private sector and realize that these cool AI tools from Google or Microsoft or You Tell Me or Mongo or what have you, and we're going to work with them. That's it. They're already out there. And the federal government's going to buy them eventually or use them.
Yeah.
So it's our culture now, but it's been, ironically, it's been part of our culture. We just haven't been really cognizant of it.
Yeah, maybe because it hasn't been so democratized as it's been over the last year or so. The adoption is big time. But what I see is like a reticence. I see a reticence and almost a fear of it because we don't have the guidance, or like the government hasn't given guidance around what what these AI policies and stuff should be. These are just kind of the conversation. This is just kind of what I'm hearing from, my interactions with other kind of compliance people who are in organizations. Right. And the response of most organizations is to kind of lock it down and so forth. It's kind of hard to lock down because people have so many personal devices, and they're going to kind of access what they are going to want to access, particularly those early adopters. They have a drive to kind of experience that stuff and explore it. And so Absolutely. They're just going to do it. You know what I mean? Right.
I don't want to say they're the problem children, but in a way they are.
They are, yeah.
They're the ones, pushing the envelope, but we don't know where the envelope is going, exactly. Or if we're exposing ourselves to liability or data problems, there's inappropriate, release of data. Yeah, and how do you mitigate against that? I mean, I think then the discussion is like a risk management discussion.
Right.
Trying to identify all the factors and make a decision based on these are the risks we can identify, these are the benefits, and so we're going to do this instead of that based on our current assessment of the risk. You document that, and you move on because that's all you can really do in good faith at this point. Maybe that's the answer.
Well, I mean, yes, I think you're right. I think it's probably about kind of taking some kind of an inventory and trying to get yourself comfortable. Like in the absence of some regulation to get you comfortable, I think you just have to use your own brain and your own logic and your own assessment of your business and the risks to kind of get yourself comfortable, knowing full well that that's going to be an ongoing process, to your point, of evolution. And, as more things get discovered and as more intersections of whatever technology we're talking about occur, we're going to get a better sort of more clarity around where the lines on the road should be. You know what I mean? We're just kind of exploring right now,
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And we're exploring, but it's kind of a high risk exploration in the sense that, there are lawsuits that are occurring certainly in Europe over AI. Yep. And, there's a lot of risks too. I mean, and there's a counter push though, because like at least with federal agencies, the Biden administration has asked us to not only are we supposed to do basically inventory of all our AI use cases currently, but also to try, in my words, experiment with using AI. Cool. And again, we're in the early phases of doing that. But AI is like part of our agency curriculum in the sense of how it operates. And it's not just like the current agency I work for, but all federal agencies, executive branch agencies. So, yeah, I mean, it's even, I don't want to say that you're sort of, the government anyway is being pushed into it, but if you could say that probably because we have to acknowledge this is where the world is. And again, once, if, Charles Schumer, his proposal goes through and there's more for it, that's for federal agencies, not DOD. We haven't gotten into the Department of Defense and how they've been using AI for years and years and years. And DARPA, all that is stuff. And then there's black box stuff that you and I don't even know about that's AI related. Because again, none of this stuff occurs in a vacuum. It just doesn't show up on an app on your phone and it appeared from a miracle from the West Coast or whatever. Yeah. There's always a backstory, at least in my opinion, of how government somehow got involved. Maybe an intelligence agency, It evolved from technology there, which again, I will never know, because I don't have access to that information. But we do know the intelligence agencies have been working on this. And DARPA, Defense Acquisition Research Agency, they even brag about it. They had the 60th anniversary of AI and DARPA's efforts in it and creating it back in the 50s, early 60s.
Isn't that wild?
So again, it's not like
imagine these massive computers in rooms doing it. AI's living then. It's wild.
Way back when, yeah. And so, that gives you, maybe it helps people emotionally to say, well, actually, for most of my adult life, for all my adult life, for my entire life, for those of us born after 1960, all of our lives, AI has been in the background in some fashion. We just weren't aware of it.
Did you hear about?
That's the best way.
Yeah, maybe that's a way to get people to embrace it. I don't know. There's just, anytime there's something new, you have to pick it up and kind of see what the risks of it are, and I don't know, you just have to kind of interact with it a little bit, I think.
Yeah.
Did you hear about this lawsuit that I think it was yesterday, where, 5 years from now, there might not be Hollywood. I might just type into my new Netflix the type of movie I want to watch, and it spins up a new movie for me. Like, who knows what that's going to look like, Anyways, Warner Music Group, I think, is suing, Sona, because this is an AI that can make music and write songs, right? And so that model was trained on a bunch of existing songs, of course. And so I think there is a panic, or there's maybe a rising panic at some of these groups. And I saw a lawsuit yesterday from Warner Music Group on how Sona or whatever trained its model on their IP. That's kind of an interesting thing. I just had never thought that a lawsuit like that could come up.
Right, and that goes to AI doesn't just come out of nowhere. It has to be trained on a database. And so who owns the database, and did they authorize it to be used to be trained to develop your AI product? Because AI is really about three things. This is very general, but there's a database, there's an algorithm, and then there's the prompt. The prompt is your command. The algorithm is how that takes your command and ships through the database. And then the database is what the AI, if you will, is trained upon. And like with ChatGPT, my understanding is it's like the internet itself. But it could be not the internet. It could be just your company's servers or whatever. That could be your database. And you could create an algorithm to help sort through all that. And then a prompt, which could be like a chat bot or whatever, to your voice recognition, that would have its own intelligence, if you will, artificial albeit, to go through that data and provide the answer. I mean, I've seen them where they'll have like something like an HR chat bot. You could ask it a question about like, what are the leave policies when my spouse is pregnant? And it'll say, oh, I understand that question. Here's the policies, and it'll highlight them from the employee manual. I mean, that's real basic, but that's already out there.
Yep.
And that's an example of AI being implemented with a chat bot within not the internet as a database, but just an internal company policy as a database.
And there's so much opportunity there. And I don't know, it's kind of an exciting time to be alive, you know?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, it's like you're living in a science fiction novel if you really think about it.
We really are. So let's. I always love to end these with this question: if you could go back in time and find a young Greg, what's a piece of advice you wish you had, earlier in your life, earlier in your career?
Other than invest heavily in tech stocks, I mean, none of us saw this. I mean, I certainly was involved with the internet. When it first started, my brother's he's like a computer science genius, essentially. And he was working on bulletin board systems back in the 80s, before the internet, before there was America Online and all that. And he was like writing programs, and I helped him a little bit with some of the company he was trying to put together. But I'd say other than invest in tech stocks, I'd say that, the future is far more interesting than you could imagine. I'd say, just be optimistic. Optimism is probably the best word. And so probably for all of us right now is to be optimistic, is that, it may seem challenging, but the human intelligence and spirit sort of overcomes things that appear to be problems right now, that there's enough of us out there, and we're enough of us that are creative and fearless enough to move things forward. I guess that's what I would tell that person.
I love that. I love that advice. I mean, there's upside in all of this stuff. Of course, there's risk with anything new. Of course, there's downside for sure. But if kind of the downside takes care of itself, like that's what everyone's thinking about. Let's focus on kind of this upside potential. I think it's a lot more freeing and a lot more exciting and a lot more impactful.
Yeah, and again, it's just like everyone's worried about AI will take their jobs, or AI will make personal world than it already is, which, you and I aren't in the same room talking, but by the same token, if we had to travel, we probably couldn't have this kind of a call anyway. It would just be over the phone or telegraph or whatever. You tell me, or carrier pigeon or whatever, but wouldn't have the same effect. Right. Unless you were a carrier pigeon, then it would probably have more of an effect. Unless
anyway. I was the pigeon, right? Well, I really enjoyed this conversation, Greg. Really appreciate you joining us on the Ethics Experts, and we will see everybody again soon. Take care.
All right. Thanks so much. Take care.